Welcome to the second and final day of the People, Planet and Prosperity Global Forest Forum, hosted by ISPI, T20 National Coordinator and Chair, and by the Think Tanks and Civil Society Program at the University of Pennsylvania in cooperation with the PIIE. What are the three main takeaways of day one on people and planet? First and paramount, is the G20 still relevant? We cannot obviously deny its importance, but at the same time, its flaws could not be hidden, as Sigmar, Gabriel, Kevin Rudd, Carl Bildt mentioned yesterday. And we should also ask yourself, is the T20 relevant? We keep saying that it is the ideas bank of the G20. But for this bank to generate even more effective returns, it should be strengthened, upgraded, reformed. Second, global health, migration flows, and the relaunch of multilateralism are all sides of the same prism. Prevention, monitoring, data sharing, broader access to healthcare are crucial to defuse the threat of future pandemic, as Carl Bildt mentioned yesterday. This involves also migrants who should be given safe access to health care through international cooperation and revised national policies. And all this cannot be achieved without a stronger multilateralism in context of G20 and well beyond. Third and last, sustainability and resilience are key to face the most serious threat to our future climate change. Concrete actions are needed in the short, medium run if we want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. But if investments are crucial, as they are, the flourishing of green finance is a must to mobilize the needed capital for investment. Today we will put the spotlight on the third P, prosperity. The same overarching question as in day one. What can the G20 do to build fairer, richer, and more innovative society? And what contribution can the T20 offer to policy making? So let me now leave the floor to the co-host of the forum, Jim McGann, and then to our keynote panelist, John Allen, which I thank very much for being with us. Please, Jim.
Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Global Policy Forum. We have consciously created this forum to engage and inform. And yesterday's program surely delivered on both of those objectives. Why are we here? Why do we convene meetings like this? And for me, I am driven by the words of Margaret Mead, who said, "Don't doubt that a few dedicated people can change the world." That is our objective, to make the world a better place for our colleagues, for our citizens, for our countries. This meeting is about that. We must, however, be realistic, responsive, and reinvent and redefine our goals in a period that is defined by both institutional and policy and personal existential crisis. No time in recent history have we faced such challenges all at the same time. It therefore requires that our institutions create a robust response, that we redefine and rededicate ourselves to meeting the challenges we face. And it is with that spirit, it is with that purpose that this meeting, which is the first of its time, so it is a profound and transformative moment where we are engaging think tanks around the world in a process that is inclusive, and is designed to be policy relevant. And so we must respond. We must be motivated. And yesterday amply demonstrated the power of ideas, the importance of institutions in essentially moving us forward, taking the lead, reinventing ourselves, and meeting the skeptics and those who suggest that there are alternative facts, that institutions and experts and think tanks do not matter. They do matter. We must believe that. We must be energized by that challenge, and we must move forward. Leadership is key. Institutions are key, and ideas are paramount. When we call for the need for think tanks to be better, smarter, faster, more digital, more agile, it is a challenge. It doesn't mean that we diminish the quality of our ideas. It does mean and does require that if we are to meet the existential challenges, we must innovate or die. It is that stark. It is that clear. And our institutions and all of us must meet that challenge if we are to meet the challenges, which are daunting in the days and years ahead. I am very pleased to introduce John Allen, a friend and a colleague and a leader of one of the premier institutions in the world, the Brookings Institution. That is, for me, also what I describe as a good global citizen of the think tank, global think tank community. John is, as you all know, president of the Brookings Institution, and he will start us off with the keynote on day 2. John, I turn to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thanks, Paolo. As always, it's an honor and it's a privilege to share the virtual stage with you and so many friends from around the world. And we continue at Brookings to benefit and to treasure our relationship with ISPE. Paolo, thank you for your leadership. And of course, our long friendship with Jim McGann and the University of Pennsylvania. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from around the world. And as Jim said, I'm John Allen. I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it is a great pleasure and a tremendous honor to welcome you to the second day of the People, Planet, and Prosperity Global Policy Forum, which, as Paolo just described, was an enormous success yesterday. Yesterday, you had the opportunity to hear from a superb roster of experts and policy thinkers who spoke powerfully on issues of global health, multilateralism, migration, as well as climate change and sustainability. Now, today we'll turn to consider a different but equally complex set of topics on cohesion, development, digitalization, trade, and finally, finance. And while these topics may seem initially disparate and diverse, they share one thing in common. They have all been directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Having robbed us of nearly 4 million precious lives and many, many more livelihoods, this is a global health crisis that has left an indelible mark on our collective future. As vaccines continue to be distributed, and the reality of a true global reopening seems to be more and more possible, it's becoming increasingly crucial that countries and governments ask themselves not just what our new normal would look like, but how we can take the lessons that we've learned from this crisis and put them to work to support the greater good. Now, it's relevant here to quote from the World Bank Group's 2021 Global Economic Prospects, published just this month. And I quote, "Following last year's collapse, the global economy is experiencing an exceptionally strong but uneven recovery. While advanced economies are rebounding, many of the world's poorest countries are being left behind, and much remains to be done to reverse the pandemic's staggering human and economic costs," unquote. Now, from the American perspective, the realities of the continued effects of this global crisis have been at the crux of the Biden administration's thinking. Since taking office, the president and his cabinet have taken proactive steps to return to and uphold a values-based transformational leadership and to demonstrate a renewed U.S. commitment to multilateralism abroad. And all Americans have heard him say it, and many of our dearest friends around the world have heard President Biden say, America is back. This renewed sense of perspective and direction was most evident during President Biden's recent trip to Europe, and I was in Europe for virtually all of it. There, he and the G7 partners released a very powerful joint statement that affirmed the shared beliefs and responsibilities of not just ending the COVID-19 crisis, but also recovering the global economy, dealing with inequality and the legacy of systemic racism, and addressing the looming disaster of climate change while seeking multilateral solutions to the complex global problems that we face today. It should be no surprise that any of these crises has or will tax these governments and their respective institutions to the limit. Even within the last year, our current environment has created stresses and pressures that capitals and countries have not confronted in generations, and in many cases, never confronted before. In other words, the tasks before us will be hard, but hard doesn't mean hopeless or that we're alone in these struggles. Rather, the moment before us demands two things. It demands vigilance and it demands resistance. Vigilance in the constant nurturing of this precious human condition, this thing called democracy, which bestows rights and the due right of health and prosperity, and the constant unrelenting resistance to the forces that would deny our fellow humans the values-based democracy that they deserve. Again, to borrow from President Biden, quote, we're in a constant contest with autocrats and autocratic governments around the world, unquote. So while all of us today are facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, I encourage all of us here to continue to work together to harness our most powerful tool as leaders and as think tanks in solving these many crises. And Jim alluded to it, as did Paulo. And that most powerful tool is truth. Our capacity to undertake nonpartisan, fact-based, and data-driven analysis is essential. First, to recovering some semblance of truth and reality, but also in directly confronting the conscious efforts of disinformation that fuel and support all of the alternatives. Only then, on the unassailable platform of truth, can we truly prescribe the policy and scientific solutions to the other challenges which we face today, which I've briefly enumerated. So, dear friends, all gathered here virtually today, and I hope someday to see you soon in person, I remain confident that we, as a global community of scholars and thinkers and visionaries, can again be the voices at the forefront of lifting up the lives of those around us and to help build back better all around the world. And paraphrasing Amanda Gorman, an American youth poet laureate, I believe we as a global community of think tanks and thinkers and experts have not only the collective power to see the light of shared values and the greatest good humanity has to offer, we have the collective capacity and the collective responsibility to be that light, to illuminate the way forward for the betterment of all humankind. So with that, my resounding and continued thanks to ISPI and Paolo Magri and the Think Tank and Civil Societies program at the University of Pennsylvania and Jim McGann, and my continued admiration for all of you from wherever you're coming at us today from around the world. Thank you. Please be safe and please be well. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Paolo.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for this inspiring opening, the perfect opening for our day 2. And I think everybody understood why Jim presented you as the perfect ambassador and citizen of the think tank community in the world. We are very grateful to you, and we can now move into the first session of today, the session on prosperity. And I'm pleased to present and introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Inger Ashing, CEO of Save the Children. Nice to have you with us. Very, very happy to have you with us. Inger, what can international effort, also in the context of the G20, which is the topic of our yesterday and today conference, achieve in reducing the impact of COVID-19 on access to healthcare, education, and livelihoods for children and teenagers?
So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about this very important topic and how COVID-19 is impacting children and the importance of international efforts, including the G20, as you said. I want to start my presentation with a quote from a 14-year-old girl from Kenya. She told us, "I'm worried about my learning. I also feel tired of home chores. I have fear of teenage pregnancy and child marriage. Schoolgirls are at the most targeted when it comes to marriage due to school closure." This is the reality for a lot of children and teenagers around the world. And the impacts of COVID-19 are felt around the world. Children's lives have been turned upside down. More than 140 million children live in households that has been driven into poverty last year. Hundreds of millions of children are still affected by school closures, with millions of the most vulnerable at risk of not returning at all, and of increased risk of child marriage and child labor. Last year, the 6 largest countries in South Asia saw 228,000 additional children dying because of disruption to health services. So this is a true challenge to the world and to the rights of children. And as we know, COVID comes at the time where we're already facing a climate crisis. We're facing a lot of conflict, which together with COVID is posing a triple threat to the populations around the world. The pandemic is threatening children's rights and risk undermining progress towards the SDGs and the pledge to leave no one behind. The pandemic has amplified huge inequalities within and across countries. The economic divide between the richer and the poorest countries had led to the former using their wealth to secure better access to tools to help their response, whether PPE, oxygen, or vaccines, often at the expense of poorer countries. They have also been in a better position to provide social safety measures to cushion their populations from the brunt of the pandemic impacts. As we look towards the G20 summit later this year, it is crucial that leaders up their game to really turn a corner on bringing an end to the pandemic and mitigating its impact. And as many people have said before me, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And taking that leadership includes contributing their fair share to close the funding gaps needed to ensure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, to tests, to treatments, and make sure that we urgently are sharing vaccine doses across the globe. And the G20 has a key role to play to help mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 and the access to health, education, and livelihood. An ambitious action is needed to build forward better with stronger, greener, and more inclusive systems for all children. The G20 can help countries address the impacts of the pandemic and protect against climate change and other shocks by supporting a global fund for social protection and expanding coverage of nationally led child-sensitive, shock-responsive social protection. It is important that countries work progressively towards universal child benefits over time. And COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for the investments needed to strengthen resilient health systems that can prepare for and respond to public health emergencies while continuing to deliver essential services for all as part of universal health coverage. Alongside domestic funding, donor investments through flexible financing and support to strengthen national health systems will be vital. Long-term and flexible finance for nutrition is needed urgently. G20 leadership and commitments will be important for us to make sure that this year's Nutrition for Growth Year of Action is a success. And similarly, the G20 commitment to education and to address the educational emergency is critical. And this includes ODA to lower income countries together with national investments to help close the education financing gap. And we look at the leadership of the G20 to help ensure a successful global partnership for education replenishment in July. Financing that strengthen both humanitarian responders and national systems is crucial to free up fiscal space to spend on social sectors and children. Aid needs to be protected, delivering on international aid targets to spend 0.7% of GNI and supporting the early replenishment of World Bank International Development Association. Alongside this, leadership needs to be exerted to support debt cancellation and devolving recent release special drawing rights quota to the poorer countries. I want to end to strongly urge the leaders to prioritize children's voices. They need to listen to children and their demands for a solution going forward. Last year, we did a global survey to hear directly from children about how they had been impacted by COVID-19. And I want to finish by telling you what they told us. Children demand action on education, including the reopening of schools and improved distance learning, an acceleration in the response to the pandemic, and increased access to healthcare, as well as a call for duty bearers to prioritize poor families with the provision of social protection. Children are calling on duty bearers to protect them from increasing violence as a result of COVID-19, and crucially, to honor their right to be heard and to participate in public decision-making on issues that affect them. Thank you.
You're muted, Jim. You're still muted. Sorry, Inger is...
Sorry, technical issue. I sort of turn it off so you don't hear me, but thank you very much, Inger. It is so important that we do not forget the most vulnerable in our societies who have been further marginalized and in some cases forgotten during this crisis. We need to continue with your voice to hear about vulnerable populations and the most vulnerable, the elderly and certainly children. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Larry Summers, who is the Charles Eliot Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University and the 71st Secretary of Treasury under President Clinton and Director of the National Council, Economic Council for President Obama. He also has been over the years affiliated with many think tanks and currently is the director of the Business and Government Center of the Kennedy School of Government and chairman of the board of the Center for Global Development. I should mention that Larry's mother is a longtime mentor of mine and was the key person in my doctoral dissertation. And I told Larry last night that to this day, she tells me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong, and has been a lifelong mentor, and we should all be so lucky. Larry, how could the G20 and other multilateral fora better deal with the current and future economic threats and ongoing instability in the international arena? And what can think tanks and other experts do to prepare us for the current transition that we're in terms of emerging from COVID, but also the long-term structural and other issues facing the global economy? Larry?
Jim, thank you very, very much for including me in this forum. Keynes famously observed some years ago that almost everything that statesmen said was the distilled frenzy of a defunct academic scribbler. Today, I would say that almost everything that statesmen say is the marginally delayed consequence of an email from a think tank scholar. I believe that the work of think tanks around the world is essential as a source of new ideas, as a test of policy proposals, and as a source of energy and pressure on governments to move forward. Many wonder whether think tanks can make a difference. I have no doubt that they make an immense difference, and often they make a difference at the most unexpected moments. If I've learned anything in my 30 years of involvement with international life and international cooperation, it is the potential rapidity of the transition from inconceivable to inevitable, and the dependence of that transition on there being a repository of ideas and expertise that is ready when a window of opportunity opens. I'm very proud to have worked during the late 1990s with my then counterpart, Paul Martin, at that time the finance minister of Canada, on the establishment of the G20 as a regular international grouping, and then to have supported President Obama at what I think was probably the most significant G20 summit since its creation, the London summit at the height of the financial crisis at the end of March in 2009. I believe that the movement from a G7 to a G20 as the dominant political and financial group guiding the international institutions was an overdue and historic step. It seems to me that the most important lesson for everyone who thinks about international cooperation is a classic lesson of economics, that public goods are immensely important, but that there are enormous incentive problems with the creation of public goods. If we relied on voluntary contribution to finance public schools, to finance national defense, to finance the FBI, we would have grave problems in the United States. We, as important and as desirable as all of those things are, individuals cannot be excluded from them. And therefore, it is very difficult to get individuals to decide to voluntarily contribute rather than to free ride. If the central problem of international order for the last 3 centuries has been the balancing of power and the achievement of stability and the absence of major conflict between nations, I believe that in part because of our success in reducing the risks of major war over the last 3 centuries, and in part because of the emergence of potential global problems, climate change, global health, pandemic risk, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, that the central problem of the international order going forward is going to be the achievement of global cooperation to produce global public goods. And it seems to me that it is that set of questions on which think tanks will need to centrally focus going forward if they are to maximize their contribution. And I would highlight in particular, Jim, the central role of global health. I am convinced that to an extent that is not yet fully appreciated, the existential risks to humanity from global health and from pandemics are comparable in magnitude to those from climate change. The risk of coronavirus epidemic and pandemic has been rising by about 8% a year for the past 3 or 4 decades. And that risk in expected value is exceeded by the extreme tail risk associated with the major flu. We have seen that the world was not remotely ready for what struck it going forward. We have seen that the world is not yet in order with respect to the challenge of achieving vaccination that will contain COVID-19 to the maximum possible. And we are only at the very beginning in putting in place a mechanism that will make sure that we are more ready the next time such a catastrophe comes. And I believe the odds that such a catastrophe will come in the next generation in magnitude greater than COVID are almost certainly greater than 50%. And so my hope is that we will see thinking on the necessary technologies, exhortations on the importance of solution, but also the design of practical mechanisms that will induce nations when attention spans shift to other topics to do what is necessary. Because I think history will judge us on exactly that question. And I am not sure yet that history will judge us far better than those statesmen who were engaged in frenetic but ultimately ineffective diplomatic action in the summer of 1914. Thank you very much.
What a start. Let me just say that to thank Professor Summer, to thank Inger Ashing and John Allen for their incredible, for their inspiring opening of day 2 of our Global Policy Forum. I thank them also on behalf of Jim, and we are now ready to move into the first session of day 2 and into the first panel on social cohesion. I'm pleased to leave the floor to Mariangela Pira, Sky TV, who will moderate the 3 panel of the policy session on prosperity. Mariangela, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Paolo, and you are right. The opening session was really inspiring indeed. I'm so pleased to be here. So let me introduce the first panel of the day. As you also may understand, and we also heard by Save the Children, globally there are more than 120 million new poor. There is also a job problem with 30 million unemployed people as a legacy of the pandemic. Reducing economic and social inequalities, granting universal access to education, which is one of the most important problems nowadays, addressing the future of work, seem necessary to preserve social cohesion. And this is one of the issues that we will address today with my first panel about social cohesion. So I will discuss this issue with my panelists, and they are Tito Boeri, lead co-chair T20 TF6, professor of economics, Bocconi University from Italy, Alejandra Cardini, co-chair T20 TF6, director education program SIPPEC Argentina, thank you Alejandra, and Cinzia Alcidi, Director of Research, Head of the Economic Policy Unit, Center for European Policy Studies in Belgium. Thank you for being with me today, and I will start with Professor Boeri. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. The pandemic has exacerbated, as we know, existing problems such as poverty, such as inequality, and at the same time it has brought about new challenges for our societies, such as remote working, for example. So my question is very simple. What are the policy recommendations that your task force will deliver to the G20 regarding all these issues? You have 5 minutes. Please, all of you, respect your time slots given.
Well, first of all, let me apologize with you if there is some background noise, but this is because I'm just coming back from the G20 meeting of the labor ministers in Catania. And therefore, it's nice also to see an airport overcrowded right now, because that's another sign of a recovery, which is gaining momentum. Yes, remote working is a new fact that we have to really take into account, because remote working increased by a factor of 3 to 4 during the pandemic. If before the pandemic there was about 10% of the workforce involved, now we are of the order of 40%. And I think it's going to last even beyond the pandemic, because many firms will try to cut on fixed costs, and therefore will ask employees to work at home for part of a week. That creates some opportunities in terms of reduced cost of commuting, environmental advantages, less also injuries, because there are many injuries, work injuries, that happens in the transition from home to work. But at the same time, also there will be new challenges involved. The first challenge relates to the fact that there is a new dimension of inequality that will arise. Housing inequality is something that has not been taken into account so far, but as long as the house, the residence, becomes a workplace, there will be new differences across workers. One thing is to work in a flat with a room and possibilities to work, good internet connection, no dependent family members to take care of. Another thing is to live in a congested residence with people to care of if you are at home, and bad internet connection. That can create huge disadvantages across different workers. And for the countries where we have some indication of the housing condition of remote workers, we do see that there are huge differences in this condition. So something has to be done in this respect. Otherwise, we are going to create a new dimension of very strong inequality of opportunities. One very important thing to make sure is that there is some support to the transformation of residents in kind of hybrid workplace condition that can be transformed during the work days into office space. And also, there should be a commitment of governments to ensure that all workers have good internet, broadband internet connection. That's very important. Also, there should be some consideration of the problems related to the fact that in remote working, the burden of family responsibility tend to fall disproportionately on women. And often behind the fall in employment rate of women, there is also the fact that many women had to really take more care of family members, and that was even more so during the period of the school closure. So that is also something that calls for better family reconciliation policies that promote an equal sharing of responsibility within the couple. We have been also suggesting many other proposals for government to take care of, and Alejandra is going to talk about some of them because they do relate to the school to work transitions. That's an area very, very important to be considered, because clearly the pandemic left us a heavy legacy in terms of school closure and educational gaps. In this respect, also, I have to say that remote working can also sometimes offer some opportunity. The opportunity can also be related to the retraining of the workers. There will be a need for quite massive reallocation of workers after the pandemic, because some sector are going to experience difficulties in the recovery, while others are already booming at this stage. So this reallocation of workers will require some retraining, especially of young skilled workers. This can be done also in remote. The remote retraining is something that can be quite powerful, because clearly there can be a possibility to train directly, enabling people to do this online, and also indirectly, because there will be no longer cost associated with having to attend in person this retraining program. So in this respect, remote condition can also work in favor of promoting a better future for the unskilled workers in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Professor Boevi. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you. I'm going to Mrs. Cardini. As Marlos Lima, Executive Director, Getulio Vargas Foundation, mentioned in the chat, the education gap between rich and developing countries, but also inside developing countries, between elite and public schools, is widening, just due to the pandemic that struck us. What should the G20 leaders do to counter these sort of phenomena that we are experiencing?
Thank you very much for your question. It's a key question. We're facing an extremely difficult situation at the moment in terms of educational gaps. And if we do not implement assertive policies to address these issues, we are definitely going to be worse in the near future. The school closures, the education emergency has immediate and long-term returns on welfare, learning, earnings, and life opportunities. And we are seeing this all over the world, but not in the same way. For example, in Latin America, the most unequal region in the world, we not only had the epicenter of the pandemic for most of last year, and Latin America includes, it has 8% of the world's population, but 25% of the deaths. And in terms of school closures last year, Latin American children lost 158 days, while, for example, children based in Western Europe lost only 52. And this is the first inequality regarding regions, regarding countries. Then there has been a terrible inequality regarding digital learning opportunities. And here also regions have very different situations. In terms of the world, we know 1/3 of the children did not have the opportunity to access to remote learning. But at the same time, we know that in West in Central Africa, only 5% of the children have internet access at home. So those opportunities are unequally distributed. Finally, in individual terms, we know inequalities compound on those who are in emergency zones and those who are facing hardcore exclusion due to factors as gender, race, language, and disability. So 3 things that we address in 3 different policy briefs that we think G20 countries have to deal now to be able to deal with the recovery and the situation that we have. The first one deals with concrete ideas on how to shift educational policies. G20 countries must institute and support mechanisms and areas of financing, provision, and regulation that proactively allocate education resources toward disadvantaged groups. So this is the key aspect, and it covers all the policy briefs and is addressing disadvantaged groups and focusing on 4 areas: educational financing, emergency digital distance learning, education and management and information, and citizen engagement for accountability and transparency. The second issue is learning and all the learning losses that are now seeing. There is a lot of evidence about this and how it affects lower socioeconomic background children. So the second policy addresses this, and It asks for cost-time effective pedagogical practice, for curriculum adaptations, and for teaching training programs. And the third policy, and this is the last one, regards early childhood policies, and it shows how it is extremely important to address early childhood as one of the main aspects to address inequalities. So G20 countries must address, on the one hand, to respond to their own problems domestically, but also as donors, and because of their influence, they need to have responses and address responses at regional and global levels to be able to deal with this problem that you mentioned, that is disadvantages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Cardini, and I agree with you. I think also that this training is so important. I mean, everywhere, also in Western countries, and above all in those countries in need. And about that, I like to talk with Mrs. Alcidi. Thanks also to you for being here with us today. What are the possible impacts of teleworking on companies' productivity on one hand, and workers' well-being, and how important is long life training for workers?
Thank you very much for having me here, and many thanks for your question, which actually gives me also the opportunity to comment on what the previous speakers said. Now, let me start briefly with teleworking. I mean, Professor Boeri already highlighted a few important points related to it. I mean, in fact, teleworking is not something new. Teleworking existed already before COVID, but it was applied only on what COVID imposed and forced. It was basically that this has become full-time, basically, and it had a very uneven impact, because not all jobs, not all occupations, not all tasks are teleworkable. I mean, already before COVID, there were some estimates. These are related to the euro area, and basically, the euro area countries, so in advanced economies, only about 30%, or about 1/3, let's say, of sectors were actually teleworkable, while the largest majority of sectors are not, at least not fully teleworkable. Now, that said, when COVID came, as Professor Boeri said, up to 40% of employees actually started to work from home. So in this sense, the increase, it was very large. Now, what is the impact? The impact is that basically that for those who actually could telework, the disruption have been minimal. For those occupations where actually telework is not applicable, the losses in hours worked and in jobs have been much larger. So in this sense, COVID has very uneven impact in general on sectors. But on the other side, when we look at teleworking, the impact was not necessarily the same for everyone. And this depended, especially in terms of well-being, as it was said earlier, depending on the conditions in which individuals, workers, could actually have a suitable setting for working from home, and on the household composition and conditions. So there are new surveys which have been released recently, basically pointing to the fact that the impact of telework on well-being of individuals have been quite uneven. And household composition played a key role, whereby families with young kids especially have been impacted in a very negative way. For others, actually teleworking has implied less cost and also advantages. This was the case, for instance, on those who had to commute and spend quite a lot of time in transportation to reach the offices. So in this sense, it is very important to take into account the heterogeneous impact of teleworking, and how actually policies could try to smooth this impact. The second point, which links to how companies actually were impacted, is to consider the fact that while reduction in cost, as it was already mentioned, it's been a sort of direct effect. The impact of teleworking on innovation and creativity is still very not known. So we still need to understand what this impact has been, but there is a growing sense that creativity, which usually is boosted by teamwork, has been negatively affected by teleworking. Now, there is one point which is raising quite a lot of concern, which is a combination from the reaction of companies and the impact of teleworking, which has been put forward recently. And it's the fact that teleworking could lead to the adoption of new forms of contractual distancing between the firm and its remote workers. So this is basically to say that some companies, in view of the fact that they could reduce substantially the cost, for instance, related to office rent, could decide to restructure and to move towards more flexible arrangements with workers who could work remotely in much more flexible base, not only in terms of time, but also in terms of contractual arrangements. And we could imagine that in extreme case, platforms could intermediate the relations between the workers and the company. This is, of course, this is not necessarily a central scenario, but this is something that needs to be taken into consideration, because it would imply that the risks related to the work conditions would be much more on workers, on the individuals, rather than the companies. And then just one word on adult learning.
Very quickly, Mrs.
Quickly?
Sorry, quickly, just 30 seconds.
So adult learning has been mentioned for years, but in fact, not much has been done when it comes to the policy, to concrete policy to favor adult learning, so upskilling and reskilling. COVID is making the need for upskilling and reskilling much more important than before, because of the need of transition from one sector to another, as COVID has impacted sectors in a different way. So in order to avoid that people remain outside the labor market for long, we need to put in place policies which favor the transition across sector, and upskilling and reskilling is usually the most important one. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mrs. Alcidi. Thank you so much for your contribution. I have one question. That's why I have to be very quick. For Professor Boeri. Professor, you have like 2.5 minutes to answer, maximum 3 minutes. Women's empowerment is key to strengthen social cohesion. That's a question from the audience in both advanced economies and emerging markets. What strategies could be designed to facilitate their inclusion in education and in the labor market? Please.
Well, there are several dimensions that are considered. One was already addressed in the panel, and that was related to the sharing of the family responsibilities, which is penalizing women very much. This has been a she session, as has been said, not only because among the sectors that have been most hardly hit by the economic consequences of the pandemic, there were many sectors where women are dominating, but also because there was a contractual dualism, and women are often overrepresented among the temporary workers who lost the job. But another key factor that reduced employment rates among women was the fact that given that there were all of these family responsibility to be taken care of during especially school closure, many women felt that they had to, in a way, leave employment and concentrate on family responsibility. So something has to be done to promote a better sharing of responsibilities within the couple. This is a matter of family reconciliation policies. Some countries in the G20 have been working in introducing, for instance, paternity leave, which was a very important institution also culturally, in giving really the signal to employers that fathers are as committed as mothers to the care of the children. And therefore, they should take that into account when hiring and not discriminate among across the gender dimension because of this reason. That's very important. Another very important area where more has to be done is in the school to work transition and in providing a better placement. Sometimes we see that there is a difficulty in women in pursuing some type of curricula as they're not adequately informed about the labor market prospects that are associated to that. And that's another very important area to be pursued. Collective bargaining is also very important. At decentralized level is very important also to promote better condition for women and to avoid any type of discrimination that may arise in this context. We have to be extremely careful because remote working is also something which is less observable to some extent. And there it's important that there is a very careful consideration by social partners at the decentralized level.
Yeah, because there is some potential in remote working, but remote working doesn't mean that you have to stay at home and watching after your kids while you are working, which is the problem that we have in Italy, in many parts of Italy right now. So it has to be addressed. Thank you so much, Professor. I think this is the issue. Thank you also to Mrs. Cardini and Mrs. Alcidi. There was such an interesting panel, so I'm very happy to have you as my guests. Thank you so much, and I see you soon. And now we move to the second panel. It's about 2030 agenda. It's still an interesting panel because, as you know, the pandemic has increased poverty, indebtedness in poorer countries, putting at risk their path toward sustainable growth. Having in mind the Sustainable Development Goals set by the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations, we will ask our panelists how the G20 can help to design innovative financial frameworks to support this sort of debt relief, promote social inclusion, facilitate the achievement of the goals of the SDG. So I'm very pleased to introduce my guests. They are Stefano Manservisi, lead co-chair of T20 Task Force on 2030 Agenda and Development Cooperation, chair Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, special advisor to Commissioner Gentiloni. Homi Karas, co-chair of T20 Task Force on 2030 Agenda and Development Cooperation, senior fellow, Center for Sustainable Development, Brookings, US. Karuti Kaninga, research professor and director, Institute for Development Studies, IDS, University of Nairobi in Kenya, and Moushira Mahmoud Katab, former Minister of Family and Population in Egypt. Thank you so much for being here with me today. So I'm gonna start with you, Mr. Manservisi. Even if global leaders' attention is focused on COVID-19 right now, we should not forget about our previous commitments, these global targets and goals I was talking about before. Like the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, what role do you see for G20 in order to tackle these things?
Thank you very much, and very, very pleased to be with you to share the experiences that we are doing. You know, Agenda 2030 is an agenda of reform of globalization, as it was conceived in 2015. And I think that in the light of the impact that COVID-19 had and is still having on developing countries, you know, this is increasingly important because it's a sort of test of capacity of the global community to react, let's say, being a bit in the middle between what is the short-term needs, in particular due to let's say, the devastating impact that the COVID is having, and the long-term perspective. So therefore, I would say, I would characterize the thinking of the task force on the Agenda 2030 precisely on this double let's say, dimension, or to make policy recommendations in order to, let's say, intervene, for example, let's say, counter the effect that COVID-19 is having on re-emerging of poverty, of chronic hunger, but also, on the other hand, to be what it's supposed to be, i.e. intimate part of building back better, and therefore whatever kind of plan for recovery. So therefore, from this point of view, I think there are 4 points and four, let's say, lines of recommendations on which this task force is working. First is about, let's say, debt relief, or to say it better, is to support initiatives which are contributing and widening the fiscal space in the countries affected by the impact of the crisis and by the increased necessity of the recovery and of the building back better. So therefore, fiscal space mean to support initiatives which are allowing to have more financial means available to the countries, by the way, the poorest and also the middle income countries, in order to have robust recovery plans. This means all the debt relief initiatives, and in particular, the special issues of drawing rights by the IMF in particular. Now, this is certainly managed by the financial, strands of the G20, but the attention on our side is drawn on the conditions of utilization of these additional funds, and also the instrument through which this liquidity could be better used. Now, there are 2 objectives that we're underlining. One is to use these additional resources to leverage private investment, de-risking them, and to facilitate access to the abundant liquidity which is available on the financial market, but which is not available at the same conditions which are allowing, in particular, the poorest countries to create what it is called good debt. So therefore, the money which is liberated in order to increase the fiscal space is important, but it will never be enough. Therefore, first objective, to support all initiatives which are multiplying them, leveraging private investment and allowing countries to go to the financial market at affordable conditions. From this point of view, what UNECA has proposed to set up a sort of African center, liquidity and sustainable facility, is a good example of this attempt to position the instrument as close as possible to the beneficiary in order to increase coherence, but second, also to use not just to spend money, but rather to leverage additional money. This is a first policy, let's say, recommendation around which we are working. A second one is about agri-food. We are working around about let's say, some ideas to promote comprehensive agri-food system. Meaning what? Meaning shorter production, transformation, and consumption chains, regionally based. We are not talking about the hyper-local. We are talking about a regional approach which is allowing to ensure the correct nutritional content of this system within a circular economy approach, in order to be flexible enough and to be managed by artificial intelligence application, by an environment, a technological environment, which is able to maximize the effect of what is available and to change also from a crop to another, and to build even more on the biodiversity which exists, I repeat, not at micro level, but at a regional level, in order to have, let's say, this integrated agri-food system. Third example is about education. I think in the previous panel, this was rightly said, because education is the key of transformation. Clearly, there is a strong focus on the dozens of millions of children which have been pushed out of school by the pandemic. And the first objective is obviously to put them back. But it is also obvious that education is a central pillar if we want really to build greener, more digital and more inclusive society. There is a whole of let's say, reasoning on all this. And for example, one of the key points is, why not setting up a global education fund as it exists for a global health fund? Today, the global architecture for education is totally fragmented. It's driven by spending money, but not by policy setting. UNESCO and the Education Commission led by Gordon Brown are thinking about, the way to articulate this from primary school to tertiary school. And the centrality of, let's say, cities, for example, and again, let's say, the multiplier of this are essential. So therefore, these are three, let's say, main areas on which we are working for policy recommendation. If I have just 1 second, I mentioned just the fourth one, because it's a bit strange. Creative industries, creative and cultural industries. This represent up to 5% of global GDP. Think about this, because it's for young people, it's for inclusive society, and it will create a lot of surprise in terms of capacities of formulating new proposals. So thank you very much. These are the line along which we are working.
Thank you. The idea of a global education fund is great, I think. And you have me also with the creative and cultural industries. I think we are in Italy. I am in Italy right now. I think it would be a great idea, really. Mr. Caras, what about the support of international institutions? International, I mean finance institutions, is key to achieve all these goals. What is the potential contribution of the G20 in order to tackle this issue, the support of financial institutions into reaching these goals?
Thank you, Mariangela, for that question. I think one of the things that's emerged most strongly out of this crisis is the recognition that rich countries have been able to actually mobilize trillions of dollars, probably something like 12, maybe even $14 trillion in order to support their recovery programs. And in emerging markets and developing economies, those numbers are much, much lower. And so already before COVID, there was a requirement, if you will, for a much larger flow of capital to developing countries to help them with the kinds of transitions, whether it's education, health, sustainable infrastructure, the creative economy, as Stefano mentioned, but the money wasn't actually flowing. And along comes COVID, and the money is still not flowing. And so the biggest thing I would say is to reimagine the way in which this flow of finance actually can be unlocked. And some of the several trillions of dollars that are now being made available in advanced economies can find their way down to developing countries. Now, there are lots of things that have already been put on the table. There's a debt service suspension initiative, but that saved $5 billion. The new allocation of SDRs, that might provide as a one-shot maybe $300 or $400 billion to emerging markets, depending on whether you include China in there or not. But even that is, maybe for most countries, it's going to be something in the order of 1 to 2% of their GDP, one time. Whereas in advanced economies, we're talking about increases which have been 5 to sometimes 15% of their GDP. We need to find ways of allocating closer to 4% of GDP every single year into developing countries. That probably means a much larger, more ambitious role for the multilateral development banks. These are the institutions that have been essentially charged with creating an efficient channel so that the money that goes is properly spent, and they need to step up the level of their activities. Now, when the money comes into a country, the second point is that obviously it has to be much better spent. And again, I think what COVID has taught us is that a lot of that spending happens at the local level. It happens in cities. It's usually cities and local authorities who have considerable responsibility for education, for health, for the infrastructure of a country. Obviously, this is where much of the economic activity is centered. It's where much of the carbon emissions come from. And so it's where the transition to a green economy has to happen. But we don't have very well developed mechanisms internally in developing countries about how to get money from the national government into the hands of cities for it to be spent effectively. And because there hasn't been a focus on that, we've never really had to face this question of answering, so tell me, if we give you the money, how much of it will actually be spent on going towards the SDGs? And tell me which SDGs, please. There are no tools to allow us to actually answer that kind of question. There are very rough things. So you will read in advanced economies, for example, that only something like 18% of the recovery funds have really gone towards what one would call a green transition. But we need a systematic process to be able to do this. And one of the things that we're working on and that's included in some of the policy briefs is there are now people who are developing such tools that link the financing to which kinds of SDGs and what kinds of impact. And one of the things the G20 could do is start to model this themselves. They could take it upon themselves to say, we're going to develop the budget classifications so that we can tell our people and the rest of the world not just how we are spending our money to achieve the SDGs domestically in our own countries, but we're also going to be telling the world how our aid and other kinds of financial support are helping developing countries to achieve their SDGs. So we need to have that link between the flows of finance and particular SDGs so that we can build trust that this money is actually being spent effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karas. Thank you so much for these interesting insights. Mr. Kaninga, what are your comments about the policy recommendations that we have heard so far? Especially, I'm interested in your point of view because you can give us Africa's point of view. What are your comments?
Sorry, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here. Sorry, my mic was muted. But I would like to begin by pointing out that Africa, of course, is not a country. It is quite diverse, even in terms of context, in terms of countries, in terms of institutions, and so on. And therefore, these recommendations that are around will suit in certain contexts and will vary very much in terms of the impact they are likely to have. So that's the first thing to acknowledge, that even if we think about a series of solutions, they need not be generalized across Africa. We need not repeat the mistake of structural adjustment program of the 1990s, where interventions resulted in more damages than alleviating the economic conditions on the continent. These proposals are certainly quite good and sound. Some of them are, if we do not go into generalizations, if we don't implement them in a generalized manner. But there is a number of things that we may want to say will be required really for some of these policy solutions to work. One is that we need to start paying attention to institutions. Institutional development and institutional strengthening is somehow implied when we start talking about the rule of law, policies that can promote SDGs, and especially the SDGs on peace and the promotion of governance in general. But thinking about strengthening institutions is very important because we know in Africa there is always a tension between the formal and informal institutions. And therefore, trying to have a balance on how both of them operate and how they drive certain motivations and certain processes in the continent matters. The solution that I find extremely very good for a majority of African continent that depend on agriculture is the strengthening of the food systems. The colleague who spoke earlier talked about increasing food production, in leveraging on existing policies so that at least we can increase access to food and make it available, make food and food available to citizens, and not only food in its general sense, but also think about the nutrition value of that food. But the point really we need to stress is that even where that access is guaranteed, Africa is suffering, was suffering a major challenge even before the pandemic. The loss of markets, the inequalities in international marketing systems of Africa producing and selling to the global world has been a challenge. And during the pandemic, I think it's all very well documented. It's now very clear that African farmers, including the peasant farmers now, are meant to compete with the imports from the developed world. And that is really not going to help in promoting food security for the citizens. We need to start saying and asking ourselves very big questions on how do we promote not only access, but also ensure that Africa has got unrestricted markets, global markets, and try to address the challenges of global markets so that at least there is income to the farmers who are involved. The last comment I think that has been spoken about here is education and how to promote access to education. But I think we need to note that even before the pandemic, there was learning poverty in quite a number of countries. Some countries have already done very well in terms of promoting access to education up to the university level. But there are quite a number of countries that were suffering, including suffering in terms of gender disparities in access. Learning outcomes were already a challenge. There was learning poverty in many instances. And this is what the pandemic has provided a very good opportunity, and therefore it's good that it's being education is stressed here. Pandemic has provided an opportunity for digital integration in learning. Schools without teachers were able to access education in some countries. Students were able to access education. But how about schools that did not have digital equipment, access to computers, access to internet, access to electricity, and so on? These already created new challenges and inequalities in different parts of the world, and we are continuing to suffer the learning losses that were there even before pandemic. And therefore, emphasizing on financing education is very important in its own right. And finally, I think the issue of technology, I think, need not to be stressed at its importance. That's the way to go if we want really to address some of these particular challenges, emphasizing on building on technologies in order to address some of these particular challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Canning. I agree with you. I mean, they have a great potential, technologies, I mean, but they have also to be used in the right way. So let's hope this potential will benefit also your country. Okay, now it's the turn of Ms. Mahmoud Katab. My question is about the impact of COVID-19. I guess we still have some problems. Okay, it's all right. So I'm going to take some questions from the audience. The first one is from Fatima Oyetunde, Trade and Development Policy Research Network. The question is for Mr. Karas. And the question is the following, talking about women's empowerment, gender balance, to what extent are the G20 countries monitoring and enforcing their development cooperation agreements to ensure these issues are effectively dealt with? Mr. Karas, please, like 2 minutes and a half max.
So I think that many countries are now starting to try to mainstream gender issues into their processes. This is not something that can be easily just switched on or off. It's a very long-term process. From a finance point of view, one of the key things is to try to ensure that there is a gender lens taken towards budgets and budget processes, both in terms of addressing the issues that that will unlock some of the potential of women. You mentioned earlier on the issues around childcare, for example. It's impossible to have an expansion of women in the labor force if you don't have alternatives for child and family care. So there are lots of things that can be done to try to take a gender lens, and the other very big thing I would mention is on peace and reconciliation. There's clear evidence that when one brings women into the political process, the chances for achieving greater peaceful reconciliation and resolving some of the conflicts that ultimately have been the biggest obstacle to development in the world get resolved. So we have to bring some of these things really to the forefront. I think some countries are starting to do it, but it's certainly a long road.
Mrs. Mahmoud Kataba, I understand you are here with us.
Yes.
Okay, I can hear you. The question for
Yes.
you is about, the impact of COVID-19 on the 2030 agenda in terms of cohesion, digitalization, and developments. I'm sorry you have like 2 minutes and a half because of the technical problems that we had, and I have to conclude this session in like 2 minutes and a half. I'm so sorry, so I leave the stage to you.
Well, we're almost halfway through implementing 2030 agenda, and unfortunately, prosperity, cohesion, and development are all worse off. COVID-19 exposed the fragility of global cohesion. 114 million full-time jobs were lost. Poverty has risen, and in a shadow pandemic, gender-based violence rose by over 30%. Worst, mistrust between citizens and the state deepened. While swift digitalization is one of the emerging winners, as it enabled working from home culture, which remains prevalent, it has not been without a cost. Digitalization has intensified discrimination, violence, abuse, and exclusion. Institutions that had stood the test of time were exposed by the pandemic. Weaknesses in national systems of education, health, and social protection rose to the surface. Even in the most advanced of countries, such systems appeared flawed in the wake of the force majeure event that's COVID. Solidarity among nations soon gave way to the divide between rich and poor when it came to vaccine equity. Human abuse of our planet has also exposed. In Africa, the pandemic is worsening amid water crisis and drought, which affected millions. Egyptians are fighting for the right to life. Their share of the River Nile water is diminishing by the day and eroding due to non-compliance with the Convention on the Law of Non-Navigational Uses of International Water Courses of 1997. Is it because of the pandemic? No, it's because international cooperation is not prosperity-driven. Hence, there is no cohesion. The only way forward is to adopt a comprehensive human rights-based approach. Agenda 2030 is in need of an intervention and cohesion, and the global scene is not encouraging it. Biden's first meeting with Putin left more questions than answers. The G7 meeting lashed out at China. Israel launched airstrikes against Gaza, and immediately the Middle East regressed to the level of violence of 1980s. This is a very serious deterioration in the security. The Eastern Mediterranean has become a major hotspot for both natural gas and geographic competition. And this will be discussed next week by ISPI. Having said this, we should not lose sight of the fact that globalization has been in the works for decades, and the pandemic has given credence to those who questioned it. With the number of deaths and infections, and 1 year from the declaration of the pandemic by WHO, evidence shows that crisis-affected countries have been especially hard hit by the secondary impacts of the crisis impacts, such as rising poverty, rising violence, and erosion of trust between citizens and state. Because of the lockdown, poorer children did not return back to school as the lockdown was lifted, but rather were pushed into the labor market, and vulnerable girls were forced into marriage and female genital mutilation. This is a reminder.
Mrs. Kataba, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I am over with the time slot given to you. I'm sorry, but your thoughts are really clear. What you say about this prosperity approach that institutions must adopt is really interesting. So we got your view. Thank you so much to you and to all the guests that were with me in this panel. Thank you so much. I have to move on. I'm so sorry, but we have these time slots given that we have to respect. So panel 3, digitalization. Let me just give you a quick overview on the main related challenges. As we are speaking, 3.7 billion people still do not have access to the internet, and 463 million students around the globe remained cut off from online education last year. How can we overcome the barriers to internet access and at the same time address gender and cultural biases that limit the potential benefits and of digital learning? I'm going to talk about all these issues with my 3 panelists. So I'm introducing them to you. Maria Chiara Carrozza, co-chair of T20 Task Force on Digital Transformation, President, Italian National Research Council, CNR. Robert Fay, co-chair of T20 Task Force on Digital Transformation, Managing Director, Digital Economy, CIGI Canada. And Samir Saran, President, Observer Research Foundation, India. Thank you so much for being with me today. So my first question is for Professor Carrozza. Digitalization should be considered a common good, as pointed out by Andres Ortega from Elcano Royal Institute in the chat. What are the policy recommendations for the G20 for a smooth and equitable digital transition? Professor Carrozza, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the question. So I try to summarize the result of our work at the Task Force on Digital Transformation. We worked on some policy brief to present to the G20 in order to answer to the question that you asked, to me and to us in general, to the task force. So we have 4 main areas of operation where we elaborated some policy brief. And first, as you pointed out, the first problem is to bridge digital divide in all forms. So we have to overcome the hard and soft barriers to internet access. And we are also to address the gender and cultural biases that now are limiting the potential benefits of the digital learning and digital tools. So as you pointed out, we have still 3.7 billion people who are offline. So the G20 must concentrate the effort on those people, because we have to do something in order to connect them and to be inclusive. And we have to support digital inclusion. And one possibility, and according to our policy brief, is to develop some tools like a digital inclusion social impact bond, which could be a solution for that. We have also to reduce the connectivity cost by subsidizing data cost and devices for connecting. So to provide tools for people to connect to internet, but we have also to invest in education. I was a Minister of Education, so I know very well that it's important to educate people and to invest in culture. And so we have to invest in schools in order to develop digital skills, because digital skills are the precondition to access to internet. So we have to invest in schools and to invest in programs for supporting schools in some countries where we don't have this education investment. And so we have to prioritize options that are usable offline and on affordable device. So this is something new. Instead of investing in more complex device, we have to prioritize simple and affordable devices in order to give access to internet. This is completely different, and I think, because I am also an engineer, that this is a very interesting challenge to work on. Then we have to level and enter into the playing field for digital economy, so especially for workers involved in platforms, and we have to investigate and study on the new labor areas in this special area of digital platform in order to make workers with some configuration which is sustainable for them. And and also we have to work on the ethics and on practice according to the use of data, different sources of data, and integrate different sources of data for developing some business. We have to regulate this area, which is correlated to the platform economy. Then the third point is to building trust and to build a sustainability in digital economy. Trust is fundamental, especially where we have to deal with healthcare data. So we have some policy brief on healthcare data and processing information and profiles according to the healthcare system. So we have to deliver new healthcare therapies and services, but we have also to deal on the use of data that the platforms are collecting about patients. And finally, which an important point, is security and privacy in the digital sphere. We have to develop also some comprehensive and global view on ethics about the use of the different tools, but also we have to provide to different countries and to also educate people in understanding the cybersecurity and security issues which are relevant. So we have to include people, but also we have to enable people to understand how to use the digital tool and to increase trust. But on the other side, trust can be increased only if we invest in some ethical and regulatory issue on digital economy. So this is all describing all is our work on policy brief.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Such an interesting overview. Thank you so much. I agree with you on the ethical issue. It has to be addressed very much so. It was really interesting to hear from you. Mr. Fay, digital governance is also a key issue covered by the T20 task force that you co-chair. What are the key takeaways on this to submit on the G20, to the G20?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And it's really my pleasure to be here. Professor Carrozza actually set up my presentation very well because I'm going to focus specifically on the policy briefs we received related to the governance of big data and AI. So let me start just briefly about why this focus is tremendously important. So over the pandemic, we have seen that people, businesses, governments have relied more than ever on digital technologies, and they provided enormous benefits to our everyday lives. And what's driving these technologies is data. And data has created this powerful ecosystem. And so while there's been this focus on developing these data-driven technologies, there has been much less focus on the governance of that data ecosystem. And in fact, we're using governance frameworks that were really designed for an earlier age. And our national and our supranational institutions and our policies and our regulations are just not designed for this data-driven economy. So going back to the point that Professor Carrozza emphasized, in fact, this undermines this G20 objective of data free flow with trust. But this objective is more important than ever. So we were very fortunate. The task force received a number of policy briefs with a rich set of recommendations related to digital governance for the G20 to consider. And so some apologies to the policy brief authors. I really couldn't include them all, but here are some of the main ones that I think came out of the policy briefs. So first, we need to embed an ethics by design approach to drive the design and deployment of AI and digital ecosystems. And that approach has to be comprehensive. It has to include education, training, toolkits, methodologies, governance models, ethics committees. We also need to figure out how to classify data and set up the appropriate forms of control over specific types of data. Data could be classified as official or personal data, data related to individuals, collective data, and each could be given different forms of control over their uses. And this form of control could come about in many different ways, but things like data trusts. But as we've just heard, there are certain types of data that probably need specific rules, like healthcare data, because the consequences of unintentional disclosure can be severe. A lot of people point to updated trade rules for governance of data and AI, but they're not sufficient. There's also a need to have soft law provisions, including interoperability of privacy laws, cybersecurity, cooperation regarding spam and disinformation, and policy coherence with competition law. And in fact, these complement each other. For example, interoperability can be a means to get greater competition in digital marketplaces. But even then, competition policy may not be enough to limit some of the harms that have emerged, and some practices may need to be blacklisted. And then there's proposals for much broader governance structures, a data governance forum for general principles on data flows and data governance. Another proposal is for sustainable technology board to coordinate and develop standards related to new technologies to achieve sustainable development goals. And then one was to create OECD guidelines for business conduct similar to the ones that they have for multinational enterprises. Probably the most ambitious proposal is to create a new Bretton Woods institution, which is coined a Digital Stability Board. And this board would be a multi-stakeholder forum with a remit to create global governance for big data, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms, while allowing national variation to reflect different values and cultures. And in particular, it would shape global standards, regulations, and policies across the platform economy, advise on best practices, as well as provide insights on regulatory and policy actions needed to address risks and vulnerabilities in a timely manner. Now, some people might question why we need a new one. Well, the current Bretton Woods institutions clearly have their hands full. And moreover, they don't actually singly or collectively span the range of issues that the digital era has spawned. So the G20 can centralize these efforts under a digital stability board to create coherent, collaborative, and comprehensive reforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Mr. Fay. It was really interesting to listen to your comments. And so I'm gonna go to Mr. Saran to talk about, Mr. Saran, cybersecurity risks which is the greatest other main issue that we have to deal with. Data privacy, they will become more and more important, and they will require, of course, multilateral cooperation. Can you please comment on the policy recommendation on this issue presented by the G20?
Thank you for having me, and I think this is perhaps the single most important domain that we will have to find collective responses to in the days ahead. You know, just as we have learned in the last 18 months that we can work online and we can live online, literally engage online, we also have to learn that crime can do that too, and risks are online as well, and security challenges are going to be more online than offline in the future. And my first proposition, and I like the idea where Bob was going, digital Bretton Woods, but I think we also need a digital security council. I think increasingly the complexity of risks and the range of events and dangerous occurrences that can happen online, which can lead to real world consequences, are going to become far more serious and imminent than they are today. And we will need to build together a collective to, in many ways, respond to this new emergence of digital threats which have real world consequences. And as we move online, this is going, as we continue to become more digital as societies, we are going to see this threat only become more prevalent around the world. So that's the first. I think we need to rethink global governance when we think digital. And the time is now. Like, we will not be able to catch up with the innovation cycle unless we start changing our policy apparatus and institutions now. Innovation takes few years to reach the market. Institutions take decades to reach maturity. We are already behind the curve. And I think this G20 should be dedicated to pleading to the leaders to start rethinking digital governance now. This is the time. We will not have time for too long to catch up with what's happening. That's the first idea and first comment on the presentations given so far. The second idea, which I really think is important and cannot be reduced to just the token standards and protocols, is around fake news and fact checking. I think this is not a technological fix. Let us be honest here. This is an ideological and a political battle that is being waged online every day. We disagree with each other, and we express that disagreement sometimes loudly, sometimes with violent consequences online. We use and weaponize information, false and true information, for certain purposes, either as communities or as countries or even as individuals. So I think the challenge of fake news, by the way, the infodemic, which was as big as the pandemic, that challenge I'm talking about, the challenge of the infodemic is not a standards and protocol issue. I think this is, again, a political leadership issue. We will need a coalition. We will need algorithm accountability. We cannot agree to Facebook saying that my algorithm did this, or Twitter saying my algorithm has found this, or some big tech company operating in distant geographies claiming that it is through some sanguine God-given process that they have acted in a certain way or another. I think the accountability of boardrooms and accountability of technology to the people they serve has to dramatically be enhanced. Technology and social sciences have to go hand in hand. People were telling me, why is it that we don't train our politicians in technology? I think someone responded that, why don't we train our technologists about social science and ethics and morality? I think the time has come to have a far greater collaboration between sciences and social sciences so that we can respond to the bigger challenge of what it is doing to societies. I love the recommendation of going down to the school. I think that's a great recommendation. I think by the time we reach the universities and colleges, we have lost the person. The person has already been trained by technology, by Snapchat, by all sorts of applications on his phone since he or she was 11 or 12. We have lost them by the time they turn 18 and they become adults. We have to start talking about cybersecurity, about fake news, about information and misinformation, about cyber hygiene, about being careful at a much earlier age. We've been missing that. The technology giants have been going down to the 10 years and the 9 years and the 8 years, while social scientists are still struggling with PhDs and postdocs and leaders. So I think we need to target a very different age group to be a more secure society of the future. I love that recommendation. Final point. The largest innovations and technology proliferation are happening in geographies that already had weak governance and weak law enforcement. The proliferation of startups and small companies are going to overwhelm many of these geographies. Along with technology, please invest in capacity building, make those countries more capable to respond to the digitalization in domains, in areas, and in regions which were struggling with governance in business as usual situation. That's my input today.
Thank you so much. Such an interesting comment, yours too, Mr. Sarana. I have two questions. Let me see if we can answer the two of them. The first one is for Mr. Fay. It's a question from Gaurav Sharma, advisor on artificial intelligence with the German Agency for International Cooperation. He says, does the use of emerging technologies provide viable solutions to achieve 2030 objectives?
I mean, I don't think anyone can doubt that technology is not going to be part of the solution. But I think, I think the point I was trying to make is it's how the technology gets used that's really important, and that's the governance. That's the governance question. We want to make sure that technology is being used consistent with human rights, for example. And other notions that we think are important to humanity, as opposed to just having technology do what technology does, the so-called technological determinism argument that's out there. In fact, technology is there to help us, and we make sure technology helps us by putting in place the appropriate governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there is another question from the audience. Africa has the most expensive internet in the world. What policy should governments implement to reduce the cost of connectivity and devices? Who wants to reply to this question? Raise up your hand. Nobody, really?
I can say this is why I can say something. I think that this is why we have to engage G20 in this issue in order to develop some bonds or social bonds or similar supporting system for doing this job. So we have to do something. I hope that G20 will take this action and make some statements in this area.
Saran, you want to add something, right?
I just wanted to quickly just make an observation. I think we have only seen innovation and technology serve for the top 1 billion on our planet yet. I don't think technology for the next 6 has really been taken to scale. And I think that is what the 2030 agenda should focus on. Technology that serves the next 6 billion. I think that must be the G20 challenge, that must be the African challenge, that must be the Indian challenge, that must be a global challenge. That how do we create technology that serves the next 6? The top 1 billion has been served. I think now it's time for the next 6. And in India, we are beginning to see that happen. But I'm sure Africa has so much energy and vibrancy. I think the solutions are going to emerge out of Africa. Partnerships, funding, and investments are essential. And I think if we can create frameworks that allow the flow of capital into the right sectors, into the right geographies, we will see solutions, homegrown solutions emerge out of the continent that we will be adopting across the world.
Thank you. Professor Carrozza, one last question for you. What about gender equality? Because it was an issue that was brought up by many, many speakers today, right? And it is an issue, especially in our countries, you know very well, better than me. Would you like to address this issue here too?
Yes, we are also focusing some policy briefing in this area. My first answer, I don't want to say the same thing many times, but is education. So we have to educate and to mentor young girls in order to attract them towards studying, and also into STEM and studies that are considered not suitable or appropriate for girls. So we have to invest in education and culture, because without this investment, we will never be successful in terms of gender equality.
Yeah, right. Are you optimistic about Italy also looking at the recovery fund that we are given by the European Commission? I think, I think what I'm saying is, do you think we can be optimistic concerning the funds we have to spend will be addressed into this issue?
Yes, I think that I have to be optimistic because I am chairing a big research institution which will be active in this area. Second, we have now the government, and it has been approved also by the European Union, has some specific investment addressing this issue of gender equality. So now we have to be very active and very pragmatic in order to implement those actions. And this is one of the most difficult tasks. So to be effective in spending some money, and hopefully research centers and think tanks, which are involved in this T20, must develop impact assessment. So the assessment of the impact of the different measures. So it is not only to provide policy brief, but also some methodology in order to evaluate the impact of all those actions. Without measuring the effect, we will never be successful in implementing policies.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much to the three of you for being with me today. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. And I hope I see you soon. Bye. And good luck, of course, with your goals. Well, I have to say these three panels were really interesting. As you may see, some of the issues are recurring. First of all, the disparity between rich and poor, say, it's one of the first issues, and it's exacerbated by what COVID-19 meant last year and also this year. The gender problem that we have to talk about more and more in order to tackle it, because especially in some countries, and not just poor countries, but in Western countries like mine, for example, is a real issue, and we really need to solve it. Because sometimes you may have seen when we have talked in the first session about work, sometimes smart working in my country, but also in other countries, is intended to be, you have to stay at home working, but it's not, it's smart. So you have to give the instruments to both men and women to work in a smart way, but also deal with the family issues. Both men and women, because sometimes it's not like that. So we need to tackle this thing. And then digitalization. Digitalization is a powerful weapon. We need to use it very carefully, respecting, as you may understand, the data privacy of the people, and also be aware of the risks that we have. And I'm talking about cybersecurity. Look at what happened in the United States just 1 month ago, blocking all the eastern south part of the United States because of a cyber attack, supposed to be. So I'm really happy with my panels, really, and I think we can move to the session 4, Global Policy Proposal for Prosperity, Finance and Trade. So I leave the panel to the guests and to the moderator.
Thank you for your kind invitation. A warm greeting to all of you, all of us, and all of you joining from around the world. Until recently, to talk of the post-COVID world was to describe a very distant aspiration, but for many parts of the world, it still is. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged countries at all levels of development, triggering the biggest global crisis in decades without distinguishing between income levels. High, middle, and low-income countries alike were devastated by the systemic and economic impact of the virus. Numbers speak for themselves. The global economy contracted 3.3% in 2020, with a loss of the equivalent of 114 million full-time jobs relative to 2019 level. Extreme poverty rose and inequality as well, for the first time over 2 decades. My region, Latin America and the Caribbean, has been especially hardly hit. ECLAC estimates that the region GDP contracted by 7.1% of GDP in 2020, representing the worst crisis in 120 years and the largest contraction in the developing world, with a loss of 42 million jobs. The crisis led to a sharp increase in unemployment and pushing an additional 22 million people into poverty, for a total of 209 million people, an increasing number of people in extreme poverty by 8 million to 78 million people across the region. In contrast to the systemic shock caused by the pandemic, the response of the crisis has underscored existing asymmetries between developed and developing countries. Most advanced economies mobilize 16.4% of GDP in additional expenditures and tax credits, and 11.3% of their combined GDP in loans, capital, and guarantees, compared to 10.7% and 7.2% respectively in emerging markets. Latin America and the Caribbean governments mobilize significant resources to address the impacts of the pandemic, spending 4.6% of GDP in emergency responses and 2.5% in public credit guarantees. However, the region lacks the fiscal space to address the crisis with the same firepower of developed countries. Moreover, the economic and social effects of COVID-19, and as well as the policy measures to address them, have significantly increased the region's financing needs, increasing, for example, public debt by more than 10 percentage points of GDP. Our region is the most indebted region in the developing world, 77% of GDP, and the region's largest external debt service as a percentage of exports of goods and services, which entails 59%. For many developed countries, the post-COVID world is no longer a distant aspiration. Welcome that. And many have moved already beyond the emergency responses and are actively redesigning the contours of a post-COVID society with new approaches to labor market, welfare, and productive policies supported by expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. However, developing countries do not yet have that luxury. We do not have the luxury of realizing a post-COVID reality. First, the unequal access to vaccines will make impossible to leave the crisis behind. And we are confronted a clearly divided world with islands of immunity in the developed world. Second, the significant asymmetries between developed and developing countries in terms of borrowing costs, market access, representation in international financial institutions, and in industrial and technological capabilities prevent developing countries from implementing the same transformative recovery plans that developed countries are crafting. A divergent recovery where green investments will stem the recovery in Europe and the US, while regions like ours are lagging behind sustainability and equality. Multilateral measures in vaccines, financing, trade, and investment hold great potential to reduce these structural asymmetries and support transformative economic recovery to achieve a more sustainable and inclusive development model. Ensuring a broad-based global recovery for developed and developing countries alike is not simply a matter of solidarity, it's a matter of mutual interest. And this is why international cooperation is crucial. The pandemic will not end until people everywhere are vaccinated and safe. Climate change threatens countries at all levels of development. Overcoming these global challenges will require a global covenant, a global pact to close the asymmetries and the global divide. And that will permit developing countries and all countries at all levels of development to achieve together a more sustainable and inclusive development pattern in the post-COVID world. Thank you.
Thank you to Mrs. Alicia Barcena, and you have heard the first speech of the fourth session on finance and trade. So I leave the floor to Franco Passacantando, the moderator of the panel of finance, which is a member of IAI, Istituto Affari Internazionali. To you, Franco.
Thank you, and welcome to you all. I will chair this session on international finance, and just following on what our last speaker mentioned, Alicia Barcena, we are in a particular situation because this COVID-19 induced economic crisis started as a non-financial crisis, very different from all other crises that we experienced recently, and the non-asymmetric crisis, because it was hitting all countries in a rather similar way. What is happening now is that it's slowly turning also into a financial crisis, and in an asymmetric one, because financial vulnerabilities are now building up, especially public debt is skyrocketing, and private debt in the form of especially corporate debt is also growing, and this is a particular concern in light of the expected tightening of financial conditions. And of course, some countries are more vulnerable than others to this possible outcome. And we see also that the developed countries are growing much more rapidly than many developing countries. Plus, as many have already mentioned, there are new sources of instability, volatility of crypto assets, cyber attacks, and so on and so forth. So we, in this panel, we will address two questions, basically. How the G20 and multilateral institutions could prevent the emergence of new crises, and how the G20 could strengthen the institutional framework of the global financial system to better manage them if they occur. And we have 25 minutes to answer these important questions. So we will have to be disciplined, and each speaker will have to speak for just 5 minutes. We have a good group of panelists, very distinguished. The first will be Franco Bruni, lead chair of the T20 Task Force on International Finance and Vice President of ISPI Italy. Gao Haiyong, the co-chair of the T20 Task Force on International Finance and director in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Luis Fernando Meja, President Fedesarroyo, Colombia. And finally, Adam Posen, which is the president of the Peter Institute for International Economics. So let me start with Franco Bruni by raising a question that we received from the chat, which is that starting from the consideration that the global financial architecture today is shaky, what are the major policy lessons from the pandemic that the G20 should learn? This is the question that José Ciaba from the Argentine Council for International Relations has raised. So Franco, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Franco. Well, José knows the answer also because he's one of the co-chairs of our task force. And our task force is now collecting the final version of 15 policy briefs. They have been developed after we have picked them out of more than 50 proposals. They have been written by about 30 authors and co-authors, and their conclusions include many recommendations and suggested policies to be channeled to the finance track of the G20. The policy areas of our briefs and suggestions range from the global financial safety net and debt burden to of LDCs and emerging economies, which are probably the most urgent global financial issues, to the digital monies. We also elaborate proposals on the transparency in global capital flows, on international coordination of central banks, on the role of ESG in international finance, on exit policies from the macroeconomic stimuli after the pandemic. My time is sufficiently only for highlighting some of the recommendations of the of our briefs. Given that Gao Hairong is one of our co-chairs and is among the speakers after me, I leave her the topic of global financial safety net, where she's an expert and author. On that relief of developing and low-income countries, let me mention the proposal of 2 new facilities to go very much beyond the current arrangement to suspend servicing of debt to very poor countries. A counter-cyclical sovereign financial mechanism is proposed to provide cheaper access to international debt markets and allow for automatic reduction of debt burden and servicing costs. And a World Recovery Fund is also described with its architecture to allow emerging market countries to swap existing debt with new debt at better conditions, with an underlying project, if possible, as collateral, possibly connected with ESG or SDG targets. Other proposals include new allocations of SDRs. On the theme of global capital flows, their transparency and the need of avoiding corruption, an update by the IMF of its framework of capital flow management measures is recommended. An important proposal is also to work towards the adoption of a globally accepted definition of state-owned multinational enterprises with a clear regulation for the disclosure of their information. The legal entity identifier mandated by the G20 and overseen by the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation should be made mandatory for all cross-border transactions undertaken by state-owned multinationals. On digital money and finance, we recommend that G20 leaders develop an agenda for a prudent transition towards the digital age. They should also impulse a global digital governance compact for a responsible and inclusive digital economy. They should set up a digital money and finance working group to perform the analysis of new digital instruments and procedures. A forum on token economy and blockchain is also recommended to improve the knowledge of the token economy. Our briefs also look at the new sources of potential financial instability that you mentioned, Franco, before, including climate change, shadow banking, and artificial intelligence. Our briefs recommend, for instance, that the IMF integrate climate risk analysis in its surveillance and opens a new financing window for climate efforts. Government budgetary instruments should be developed for climate risks. A specific proposal for insurers to offer insurance against pandemics, which are a source of financial instability, is also made with a description of a possible pilot project. Well, these, I repeat, are only some of the suggestions of the G20 produced by Task Force 9 of the T20, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Franco. Let me now turn to Gao Hairong. I know you have focused your contribution to the T20 on the topic of the global safety net, as Franco just reminded us. So what will be your advice and recommendation to the G20 on this issue, and how to make best use of the multilateral coordination to enhance the resilience of the global financial system? Hairong, your 5 minutes start now.
Right. Thank you, Franco. Thank you so much for having me in a panel. I will limit my talk on one of the key areas the task force is dealing with, the global financial safety net. I'm also co-author of policy brief with 4 other fellow scholars on this topic. So first of all, I want to point it out that the pandemic crisis actually demonstrated that the well-functioned global financial safety net is essential to safeguard financial stability. While the IMF is in a central position to do the job, the G20 actually also played a role by prioritizing the tasks and guiding the principles based on consensus. So at the same time, it is also important to realize that the challenges in the forms of uneven rebound, vulnerabilities build up for those who are lagged behind, and that stress in the countries lacking investment and physical space are all stress for solid recovery globally. So that makes a case that current form of global financial safety net needs to be updated. What should we do that? I think the actions that focus on adequacy of financial resources, variety of financial tools, coordinations of national policies, and multilateral institution cooperations are all essential. There are a number of ideas proposed by the task force. I just highlight a few. First, mobilize the funding source. The committee of a new allocation of MF SDR is a very good start. It will certainly enlarge funding source. It can also be a good start for rethinking the role of the SDR, because SDR is one of the most underutilized resources provided by multilateral financial institutions. And we suggest the rethinking should go beyond crisis management. Second, optimize liquidity tools. And the currency swaps are very useful in times of liquidity crisis. And because they are operated on a bilateral basis, there is plenty of room to improve it, such as to set up a multilateral swap mechanism, either in the MF or through a certain group of countries. This is a way to make the swap line scalable and more accessible for countries in need. And there is also a proposal for global liquidity insurance mechanism, which can provide Forex liquidity in a systematic way. Three, work on the missing links in a global financial safety net. One missing link we found is the regional financial arrangements. They are very important layers that is linking national reserves and the International Monetary Fund supported program. In the past, they actually played a positive role in handling with financial crisis, like the European Stability Mechanism in sovereign debt crisis in 2012. But during this pandemic, very few were activated due to various reasons. So in fact, a fully utilized regional financial arrangement can largely fill the hole of funding resources and enrich the tools. Another missing link is a monetary cooperation. This is very difficult because, when the countries are at different phases of recovery, they could have a different target. But it's equally difficult to ignore the spillover effect, which are basically a source of instability. So we suggest the G20 central banks in G20 countries should explore the ways to deepen policy dialogues and coordinations, at least to avoid sharp turn of market expectation. And my final thought, because global financial stability is public goods, it requires a very strong sense of cooperation. The global financial crisis in 2008 actually provided the momentum for G20 countries to come together. And this pandemic, I think, given its magnitude and the multi-dimensional repercussions, should be the case for even stronger sense of financial cooperation. And our T20 community actually shares such a spirit, and I'm very grateful to be part of it. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hayong. And let me now ask Luis Fernando to focus on the Latin American perspective in relation to the issues and the proposals that we just heard, and especially if you give us some indications of what are your concerns about Latin America in terms of financial stability at this particular juncture. Luis Fernando, please.
Wonderful, Franco. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate the task force team for these recommendations that are really comprehensive and I think go to the point of rethinking the international financial architecture to make it more qualified to respond to these type of crises.
I would like to comment on as you said, Franco, on the perspective from emerging markets and of course Latin America about what we think are the main issues in this redesign of the international financial architecture. First, I would like to emphasize, and the task force also emphasizes this, on the strengthening of the IMF special drawing rights, the SDRs, which is essentially the only truly global reserve asset. And there are two issues that have to be addressed to further strengthen the role that SDRs play as a reserve asset. First, the elimination of the dual accounting. The IMF currently has this general resource and the SDR accounts, and that makes sometimes irrelevant SDRs as a source of reserve. And there has been a recommendation that has been made for many, many years. Hopefully, this is the time to eliminate this dual accounting. The other, and the task force also mentioned this, is about the SDR distribution. You have mentioned the inequalities in terms of the impact of the crisis, in terms of developing and developed economies. And currently, essentially emerging and developing economies have to self-insure against this type of cycles by accumulating foreign exchange reserves. And the distributions of the SDR are essentially made through the size of the IMF quotas. But unfortunately, typically emerging markets, and in Latin America is an example of these, have high needs of reserves when you have a crisis like the one we're currently suffering. And that implies that maybe there is an opportunity for thinking about different criteria for allocating IMF SDRs, and not only through quotas, which of course imply that larger countries end up with larger SDR shares, maybe thinking about, for example, like criteria related to demand for reserves, which would help emerging markets and developing economies. The other point would be strengthening ex-post unconditional financing mechanisms. The task force talks about new financing mechanisms, which I think very interesting, but I think there's currently a mechanism which is the flexible credit line that is very important and has been relatively unused. Just Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Poland have used this mechanism, and the purpose of these flexible credit lines is to reduce the stigma of coming to the IMF when you have a balance of payment crisis, and you do this ex ante. Countries which have strong macroeconomic, economic records and have strong policy frameworks can apply to this flexible credit line to actually have the opportunity when the crisis comes to draw on the quota assigned through the FCL and reduce the impact of this type of crisis. And this was very, very useful for Colombia. Colombia, as I mentioned, is one of the few countries that has used this line. And Colombia in November of last year made a drawing of about $5.4 billion. That's about 2% of Colombia's GDP, which helped, of course, in terms of maintaining strong external buffers and helping meet higher financing needs. And I think the strengthening of this type of mechanism that reduces stigma of coming to the IMF, they're unconditional exposed. Once the crisis comes, you don't have to do anything else because you already did what you had to do before the crisis, are very important for emerging markets in terms of having this access to finance. I think the task force also talked about how to strengthen international debt workout mechanisms. They propose some mechanisms for this. I think we're in a scenario where there's an important risk of debt overhang, and the international financial architecture has made great strides towards strengthening emergency financing, but not so much in terms of debt workout mechanism, which I think it's one of the questions that stands to be resolved. And finally, I agree a lot with what the task force mentions about incorporating new dimensions into the financial architecture, like climate change, AI, inequalities. I would like to just mention that inequalities have very, very different dimensions, not only about inequalities across countries, but within countries, we have sectoral inequalities, we have skilled versus unskilled labor inequalities, and we also have gender inequalities, which have to be incorporated into this analysis for the new financial architecture. Thank you very much, Franco.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. And now let me turn to Adam. Adam, we heard quite a wide range of proposals, recommendations that this task force to which you contributed has produced. How would you prioritize the different types of intervention? Where do you think there should be the top attention of the international community in light of what we learned from the G20 during the pandemic crisis?
Thank you, Franco. And I want to praise Franco Bruni, Hai Hong Gao, and the members of the task force for what they've achieved with this report. I actually was not a member. I'm grateful to Paolo Magri and ISPI and Jim McGann and TTCSP for including me in this discussion. I think you're right, Franco, to start with the issue of prioritization. As is the nature of the G20 and therefore the T20, the task force covered a vast range of issues, and some of the issues, such as the SDR ones that Luis just mentioned, are issues that have been around for a long time. And if this is the moment at which it is ripe to make positive changes that have been a long time waiting, that is a good thing. But I'm going to suggest a somewhat narrower focus, and starting from the fact that what this crisis has shown is that the international financial architecture has improved in ways we didn't fully realize. I think when we look at 2008-10, it was already somewhat surprising given the irresponsible financial excesses in the US, the UK, Germany, France, Greece, and so on, how well a number of lower income and emerging market economies came through it. And if anything, what we've seen for the last year is even more so, in the sense of financial room, in the sense of central banks and finance ministries able to do macroeconomic stabilization, able to sustain whatever degree they have a welfare state. I don't want to suggest there's no debt issues. I don't want to suggest certainly there's no human pain. I'll come to that. There's terrible human pain. But the striking thing is how well the system worked. Most of the countries that are suffering now are suffering because of unfair distribution of vaccines, of excess vulnerability to tourism as a source of income, of issues in their health structure that no one can control. And I realize other parts of the T20 are addressing this, but I think we need to take stock and say that the international financial architecture has done better. It would be good, as my colleagues Maury Obstfeld and Ted Truman have argued, to broaden the swap line so it's not dependent just on the Fed. It would be good to, as the committee recommends and Luis endorsed, to change the SDR structure so it is more representative and inclusive. But the fact is we have had very little directly financially caused problems, and if anything, a surprisingly large amount of macroeconomic stabilization in this crisis. And for that matter, even the fund and the bank have encouraged rapid access to credit and programs. So what is it that instead this should focus on? I would say three things. The first is that the G7 and the G20 are continuing to do vastly too little in terms of providing vaccines, not just the quantity of doses, but the distribution and the infrastructure in a rapid form to the rest of the world. And there can be no lasting recovery. In fact, there will be lasting damage if this is not done more quickly. Again, I know the rest of the T20 is saying this, but it's the role of the finance ministries, the IMF, the World Bank, to just make clear how great the damage will be if we have persistent illness and destruction of human resources, of labor force, and healthcare burdens persisting in the developing world. And as my colleagues Steve Kamen and Joe Gagnon have argued, as well as Monica DeBola and Chad Bown, this will pay for itself. It's not just the enlightened self-interest, as the closing of the last session suggested. It is that really in economic terms, if the rich countries put up the money, they will get more than it back at this point. And this is where the international financial institutions should be emphasizing. The second point is in terms of the debt workout for what is the overhang here. There are real issues that, again, because of the nature of the T20 and the G20, could not be said about Chinese lack of transparency on debt, as has been raised by Anna Gelpert, or documented by Anna Gelpert and her co-authors. And this should be used as a jumping off point for greater transparency and accountability for debt from the Western economies. This is an excuse to say that when debt accumulates through no fault of anybody, let's take advantage of the situation. And so even though I'm suggesting that the debt problem isn't there yet, this is the main thing to do. The final thing is we need a push for investment and adjustment to climate change. The IFIs have spoken about this. This is the time to say it. Don't get caught up in anything else. That's where the fiscal emphasis should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks to you all. I think this was a very fruitful session of this conference, and I'm pleased that it shows that the G20 is able, and the task forces around the G20s are able to gather sufficient intelligence to make proposals for addressing the issues we are facing. I mean, we all recognize that the G20 is particularly effective at times of crisis, and this has been particularly true after the 2007 crisis and the other financial crisis. The issue is whether also this G20 during a pandemic crisis will also be effective in creating a catalyst attention on main issues. And I think that what we heard is certainly indicating the right direction. I cannot concur more with Adam that the top priority is the vaccine and the need to provide further advice to make sure that the global community will consider that as a very top priority. And we see some signs that we are moving in that direction. And also the fact that we have to face the issue of debt. Fortunately, we are not already in the face of a debt crisis, but it's clear from what we see that we have to be prepared for a debt crisis. And we have seen a number of proposals to address that. And finally, the climate. I mean, the climate change issues, I am particularly, I see that never before during a crisis, the issue of climate has been so much addressed, even though the main issues are of an economic nature, of a financial nature, but climate is on top of our radar screen. So I thank you all. I appreciate, I look forward to reading the reports that you have been working on, and I think I can close this session at this point. Thanks to you all.
Thank you, Franco. So now let's move from financial stability to trade. 5% drop in global trade in 2020 and 42% drop in FDI in 2020. Clearly, there will be no sustainable and resilient recovery without also a strengthening of international trade, a more equitable international trade, and the relaunch also of investment. So what are the multilateral efforts which are needed to these aims? And this will be the main focus of our session, the session on trade. I have a very distinguished panel, high-level speakers, so let me just present them. We have Piercarlo Paduan. He is the lead co-chair of the Task Force on Trade, Investment and Growth of the Team 20. He is Vice President of PIIE, and he is the former Italian Minister of Economy and Finance. Then we have Said Akman, who is a co-chair of this task force and director of the G20 Studies Center at TEPAV in Turkey, together with Marik Elka Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, Kyoji Fukao, President of the Institute of Developing Economies, JETRO, in Japan. So thank you all for joining us today. So let me start with our first panelist, who is also the lead co-chair of our Team 20 task force on international trade, investment and growth, Professor Padua. So Professor Padua, the pandemic has added on top of existing challenges, such as the increasing importance of digital trade, environmental sustainability, and the need to support more vulnerable actors. So what are the main findings of the task force to this aim? Or simply put, what can we do at the level of the G20, at the multilateral level, to have a more equitable trade and sustainable trade for the future? So please give us your insights and the preliminary policy recommendation of the task force. Please, Professor Padon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to exchange views on such a fascinating set of topics, but also a challenging set of policy prescriptions. As you yourself, Antonio, said, there is a combination of issues when one talks about trade. It starts with the fact that trade is now to be seen against the background of the pandemic crisis, in a time in which the climate change pressures are increasing, in which there is new opportunities and challenges with the new digital technologies, and unfortunately, a situation in which, as we see it, the exclusion of poor people and weaker segments of the population seems to be going up rather than down. So this suffices to generate an agenda for policymakers, which is impressive to say the least. And indeed, what our task force has been looking at is a set of new recommendations and policy challenges, which, however, seem to be the ones in the past, coming from the past. This is only apparently so because we certainly inherited from the past discussion on trade issues, the fact that it's not just about trade. It's about trade, it's about investment, it's about regulation, it's about cooperation, it's about institutions. So this is the agenda, where the agenda starts from. We need, and this is not new, to revamp the functionality and centrality of the WTO in confronting what has been called deglobalization, which is a misleading concept because it seems that there might be less of an opening, both in terms of trade and in terms of investment. This is not the case. We are possibly more trade integration, more investment integration, and more interlinkage between economic and non-economic international challenges. So providing an institutional order to those issues is not easy. Well, first of all, so let me give you just a few examples of what our reflection has been doing in terms of new topics. Well, some new topics are new topics because they apply old problems, old challenges to new concepts. One is certainly digital trade. Information is the most valuable source of income and wealth that we are looking at in a global sense. So we need to find ways to deal with the production of information and having technologies able to deal with that, while at the same time avoiding unpleasant effects in terms of private protection of privacy, which is extremely important in order to provide the incentives to remain open. Because one of the issues is if there is the sensation, the impression that policy is too intrusive in terms of what needs to be done with data collection, then this might be a threat towards the maintaining of open markets or open trade markets. But the nature of trade, which is based on exchange of information, it necessarily requires that it's not just about exchanging information, but also producing an efficient interaction between trade of data and investment, which is based on knowledge creation and knowledge exploitation. So this is where possibly technology comes more forcefully into the picture. And investment here is to be considered in a sort of a different way from the past. Mostly has to be considered about intangible investment in intangible assets. And we may consider economic and non-economic activity as a multidimensional activity in terms of accumulation of assets, be there human capital, tangible capital, as I said, infrastructure capital, knowledge capital. We have to take into account all of these elements in one unified framework to understand what are the policy implications. Maybe people that have my age may remind that when we came to the trade chapter of textbooks, it was about material exchange of material goods and also some discussion about services with limited scope. Trade is more complicated because it's about several kinds of assets and issues, but it's also complicated because it has an impact and it is impacted by environment. And indeed, the way we consider exchanges and production today is more related to new paradigms where environment is more prominent. We all know what the ESG paradigm is: environment, social and governance, sustainability, which are elements which need to be checked when people and companies and nations interact to the open global system. How is trade in ESG factors impacted? And so I could go on for a long time, but for the purpose of not losing too much time, let me conclude with one aspect, which has been very much at the center of the policy debate after the bursting out of the pandemic crisis: the future of global value chains. Global value chains seem to shrink, seem to become smaller and shorter because they've related to more condensed regional aggregations. This is not the case. It's a different way of looking at global value chains, exactly because now it's impossible to deal with one element, one factor, one product when you talk about trade. It's a combination of these elements, and therefore their aggregation to value chains may produce results and structures which are even more complex than the ones we used to have. So this makes policy intervention even more challenging. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Padoan, for this very effective summary of the results, the preliminary results of your task force. I was really struck by what you said when you mentioned that it's not only about trade, it's also about investment, cooperation, regulation, institutions. So let's stick to regulation, to rules, to institutions. And I take a question from the chat, from Claudia Schmucker, because she is asking, time might finally be ripe to reform the WTO. Lucky enough, we'll see, possibly at the next ministerial meeting to be held in November. Let me turn this question to Said Akman. Said, welcome, nice to see you, virtually meet you again. So Said, what is your view on this? Do you think that time is really ripe? Please.
Thank you, Antonio, for inviting me to this esteemed G20 event. Actually, the WTO reform is high on the agenda. The need to reform WTO was recognized by the G20 leaders previously, as you all know, that they committed to support the necessary reform to improve the functioning of the WTO system. So far, several proposals have been tabled by 40 WTO members or more, mainly from the major stakeholders. I think they're differing positions and they're differing views. I observed that there is a sharp divide among the parties. Not all members consider market-oriented policies or sustainability among the principles of WTO. Some members stress that the consensus based decision-making and special and differential treatment are integral parts of the system that must continue, while others consider that these need to be redefined.
Some desire to address existing problems urgently, while others ask for new issues to be negotiated and be regulated under new rules. So every member actually describes this elephant in its own way as it wants to do it, but they need to converge their differing positions in order to prevent the flaws of the system and to provide a forum for negotiations. I see two main argumentation behind the calls for WTO reform. The first one is about that the system is not working effectively with respect to its main functioning, providing, for example, not a suitable forum for negotiation with this under these conditions, dispute settlement and monitoring. But also there is a second argumentation which reflects the conviction that global developments are not well reflected in the WTO rulebook, in the acquis. How should they be formulated? So the system should be formulated that much needed rules for the areas induced by rapid developments in technology, in digital trade could be addressed, or in other issues like services, like subsidization, climate issues. So I think this is very much relevant to changing geopolitical balance of power also, which is mirrored in the WTO reform debate we see. Let me bring some of my remarks for these proper conditions to establish for the future agenda of the WTO reform. First of all, there's a need for a shared vision of virtues of the multilateral system among the parties, where the focus should be on setting rules, not dictating the outcomes. So it is understandable that parties should rely on some convictions on needs to ensure that there is economic recovery in times of crisis, that they supply chain resilience and supply security, improving green technologies, reducing dependencies on others. These are all understandable, but these methods should not serve for what is called as a managed competition or predatory rivalry that can bring us to a kind of multipolar world than a multilateral system under the policies like regulatory muscling, investment screening, export protectionism, heavy subsidization, governmental intervention. There's also the risk of having a mission creep for the WTO, that its boundaries between trade issues and other governance issues need to be better aligned. So the second, as we need this shared vision, we have this shared vision in the recent G7 transatlantic agenda, but this is not sufficient for the reform of trading system because it is not inclusive. It should be taken at the G20 level to include other non-G20, G7 countries, and also there are normative differences that we should also consider. So coming back to our task force, some of the highlights of some proposals from our task force. First of all, with respect to reinvigorating the WTO as a negotiating forum, there are proposals with respect to plurilaterals, which can be a stepping stone for reviving the negotiation process. But this is a very much debated issue as well. But finalizing successfully of the joint statement initiatives is vital. But I see that many developing countries are not participating in many of these plurilaterals. That development aspect is quite important. Second, some controversial issues. I will just choose one or two within my limits, and I will finish in 1 minute. The very controversial issue of subsidies. There is a call for commitment to a standardized process for the evaluation of subsidies, to calculate the domestic effects of subsidization, because subsidy is not only a beggar tie neighbor policy, but beggar tie set implications it also has, and need to be focusing also on the implications in the domestic economy. Second, the state-owned enterprises, and there are proposals in some of the policy briefs that a due reference to the experience under other mega deals could be proposed, like CPTPP or USMCA or the one between China and the EU investment. And finally, special and differential treatment, which is also another urgent issue, that the member states should leave the debate reclassifying the developmental levels of the countries, but should have a much pragmatic approach to bring some flexible, tailor-made reflections on an issue-by-issue basis, while existing obligations remain largely unchanged.
And finally, we have the issue of agriculture, which is also important for many developing countries, that the task force proposes a G20 plan of action on agricultural trade, focusing on the issue of export restrictions in view of the food security implications and vulnerability of the developing countries. These are some points that I can describe on the way to MC12 and on the way to the G20 summit. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you very much, Said, for this very rich list of policy recommendations. But now let me turn to Mari Elka Pangestu. Welcome, my pleasure. So my question for you, since you are at the World Bank, what is the role that a multilateral bank can play in supporting this process, the reform of the WTO? Well, of course, you know, it's not exactly the duty of the World Bank, but I mean in supporting at least, you know, international trade, and especially for developing countries. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to join another T20 event. I'm a big fan of T20, so this is why I agreed to do this session with you all, because I think it's very important to have the outreach with all the think tanks. G20 is not just a government G2G discussion. So I wanted to just respond to your question by starting with the immediate issue of recovery and the importance of trade and multilateral cooperation in the link between the uneven recovery and the equitable access to vaccines, which was raised in the previous session. You know, our latest projections actually show that we will have a rapid rebound of the global economy, the fastest post-recession pace in 80 years. But the recovery is uneven, and it is linked to the size of the fiscal stimulus and vaccine access. We know that the distribution has been very unequal, with the poorest countries, especially in Africa, only getting around 4% of the total available. Therefore, other than the financing issue that Adam raised in the previous session, I think when you link it to trade, it is key for cross-border issues, including trade and the vaccine value chain, to be addressed to avoid delays in redistribution and financing, and preventing production disruptions due to lack of inputs. We can learn from the Serum Institute recent experience. So here's where the multilateral cooperation is key. And I'm happy to share with you that given the urgency to act and quickly, a task force has been created between the World Bank Group, IMF, WTO, and WHO to really focus and move urgently on these issues and prevent such bottlenecks. It's also actually affecting food and other critical supplies. So, in the immediate issue of recovery. Turning to the role of trade and investment to jumpstart a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery and growth, let me just also share that if you look at the trade numbers, trade in goods have recovered and actually are higher now than before the pandemic, but the recovery is also uneven. And it's uneven with recovery happening in sectors and regions which are integrated into global value chains. Whereas those who are not, such as South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, and the Caribbean, continue to lag in trade recovery. The other notable trend is that trade in services have not recovered because tourism and travel have collapsed. But trade in services of business services, communications, and digital-based services actually continue to grow at a positive growth rate. And recovered and continue to grow at positive rates. So pointing out to the importance of the role of trade in services, in GVCs, as well as digital trade, data flows, and so on. So I think this is a new area of development that we have to be looking at how developing countries can enter into. So what should be done, and what is the role of multilateral development banks like the World Bank? First, I was a trade minister during the global financial crisis, and one of the easiest thing to do, costless thing to do, is reduce the cost of trade, because trade costs still remain high, and it's not because of tariffs, it's because of trade facilitation issues. There's an infrastructure part, shipping and logistics, but the cumbersome trade procedures and processes at and behind borders. We are working with governments on these trade facilitation issues. It's an easy win, quick win that will deliver immediate results. besides the comprehensive trade reform packages on liberalization, transportation, digital infrastructure, GVCs, and so on. And as we look, just let me close finally with a few thoughts on green, resilient, and inclusiveness as we see how trade needs to play a role. On green, it's important to note that trade is critical to the climate change solution. Carbon pricing is, in a carbon-constrained world, would foster more efficient production and has increasingly been part of countries' competitiveness. So we need a coordinated approach on carbon pricing. Otherwise, carbon border adjustment taxes will impede trade flow. So we are working with developing countries to come up with their carbon pricing systems. And trade policy reforms could also contribute to emission reductions by ensuring that environmentally friendly technologies are not subject to traditional trade barriers. On resilience, note the integration into GVCs can help developing countries build resilience to economic shocks, as we have seen with the current trade recovery. GVCs can be shock transmitters, but they're also absorbers. So in other words, nationalizing value chains is not going to improve resilience. We need to continue to push on global value chains. And finally, on inclusiveness, the gains from trade need to be inclusive, and complementary policies are needed to ensure that that happens. We have recent studies on this, including the role of women in trade. And it is really about ensuring that complementary policies are there so that the gains from trade can be distributed equally. Labor mobility rigidities, for instance, have shown that this has led to less distribution of trade. We have knowledge, data, and tools to work with countries to spread the gains from trade and make it more inclusive. On women, the role of women, it's a critical determinant that the role of women in trade in promoting gender equality is crucial. We have found that higher tariffs, peak tariffs, are actually prevalent in women-intensive sectors such as garment. So we really need to also work on that area. And finally, we do also provide trade financing targeting SME and women exporters and importers, just as a closing on what a concrete policy that we do. So I hope I've given you an idea of what we should and what MDBs do to support all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. So now let's move to Kyoji Fukao. I thank him because it should be quite late in Japan now. So thank you, Kyoji, for being with us. So in your view, Kyoji, how do regional trade and economic integration, especially in Asia, fit within the broader multilateral picture? Please, over to you.
Thank you, Antonio. It's midnight here. And what we have learned through negotiations of regional trade agreements in Asia is that tariff cuts are not sufficient to enhance or even maintain the efficiency of the international division of labor. For example, the recent agreement on RCEP has been criticized because it does not cover important issues such as government subsidies and dispute settlements. For broader multinational agreements to be successful, either at the WTO or the G20 level, a broader scope of negotiations and transparency of member countries' policies are indispensable. Many countries are currently introducing new investment screening mechanisms. Some large countries are not transparent about government subsidies. So we need to solve these issues in order to go ahead within multinational cooperation. For this purpose, I hope that the G20 enhances studies on member countries' policies and economic structures that are closely related to international trade and FDI, such as government subsidies, investment screening mechanisms, including policies based on national security considerations and CO2 emissions, because, as Mari Pangetz pointed out, carbon taxes will become an important trade issue, and resilience of GVCs and service trade. I think that the G20 can learn a lot from the initiatives and the experiences of the OECD. And in Asia, some research institutions, such as ERIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and IDE-JETRO, my institute, are studying these broader issues intensively. I think that these Asian institutions could collaborate with the G20 on further research on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyoje. Thank you for being with us until late. And we are actually running a bit late, so I have to close now this panel. I thank all the panelists for the excellent contribution you gave to this forum. Then now I move to Paolo Magri for the closing session of our forum. Thank you. Paolo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonio, and thank to the great panelists you just greeted. We move to the final session, which will be closed by Jim McGann. But before that, I have the great pleasure to leave the floor to Ambassador Luigi Mattiolo, Italy G20 Sherpa, with whom we are working very closely to secure adequate T20 concrete impact on the G20. Ambassador Mattiolo, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Magri and Professor McGann, for hosting this important event and for giving me the floor. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and to contribute to this discussion, which has touched upon several of the key global challenges, not only for the G20, but for policymakers and governments worldwide. I have no doubt that the insights and ideas discussed over the past 2 days will greatly contribute to the upcoming T20 summit in October. I'm looking forward to receiving your recommendations as the Italian presidency highly values the contribution of the G20 engagement groups, which are an integral part of the G20 process. There is indeed a key role to be played by civil society, academia, the private sector, people and institutions of all backgrounds in our efforts to foster an inclusive and sustainable economic future for all. We face challenging times. We are combating a pandemic that has affected all of us, cost more than 3 million lives, and is still raging in large parts of the world. The health crisis has had severe impacts on our economies and increased unemployment across the globe. It has deprived millions of their livelihoods and restrained access to culture and education. It has hampered progress towards the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and, in many cases, caused serious setbacks. At the same time, many urgent, long-standing issues remain unresolved, from addressing inequalities to becoming better custodians of our planet, while we are still learning to adapt to the digital revolution. This is the context in which this year's G20 is taking place. It is a complex scenario, but also one that provides many opportunities to build back better, with a leading role to play for the G20. It is our task to find common solutions that keep different stakeholder needs and perspectives into account, also by leveraging synergies between governments and civil society. This is the rationale behind the program of work of the Italian presidency, aimed at promoting quick, green recovery and setting the foundation for equitable and sustainable growth. There is, in short, a wide range of actions ahead of us, and we will need to work together to succeed. I strongly welcome the important contribution of the T20 in pushing these discussions further and look forward to the recommendations that the group will present to the G20. I thank you for your attention.
Simon and Garfunkel to end our Global Policy Forum. Some of you may think after 2 intense days we need some music. not only for that, and please be reassured, Jim and I will not pretend to emulate Simon and Falken closing the forum with a song. We end up with Simon and Falken because in Central Park, almost 40 years ago, they sang The Sound of Silence. And for 2 days, we have heard the pleasant sound of ideas, ideas presented by a stellar group of keynote speakers and panelists, thanks to all. They sang Hello Darkness, My Old Friend, and for 2 days we have discussed sound policies to get out of the darkness, the dark time we have experienced for almost 2 years. They thanked the police department and the fire department. And I wish as well to thank the Global Policy Forum, Police Department and Fire Department. Jim again, the law enforcement engine of the think tank community and our valuable partner for this forum. Thanks, Jim, a great pleasure as usual. Our fire department was made up by a large group of colleagues at ISPI. Most are so young that at the time of the concert in Central Park, their parents were at high school. To thank all of them allowed me to single out 3 firefighters, Alicia, Antonio, and Francesco. Simon and Garfunkel ended up thanking people that never get recognized for doing good things. And let me also end thanking the technical staff behind this event. They did a super job in transforming ISPI in a sort of TV studio, innovating and improving the quality of our virtual format. See you on October 4 to 6 at the T20 Summit, co-hosted by ISPI and Bocconi University. Jim, with pleasure, I turn to you for the few final words.
Paolo, thank you very much. In contrast to you, I will sing my final words in terms of summarizing this 2 days. I would say and refer to a song, and what this forum has provided is a bridge over troubled waters. Thanks to all of you for an exceptional, inspiring, and informative set of presentations. And bravo to Paolo and the ISPI staff and the interns and staff at the University of Pennsylvania who have helped on my end make this possible. Over the last 2 days, the Global Policy Forum has clearly and demonstrably demonstrated 6 things. 1, the power of ideas, institutions, and leadership. 2, the power of positive and forward thinking. Above all else, it underscores the value and importance of international cooperation and an inclusive and engaging process. 4th, the T20 is the think tank for the G20, or an ideas bank for the G20. And it is the role and our role to make sure that great and good ideas that are presented in the policy briefs make it into the G20 final communique. Most of all, the last 2 days have underscored that think tanks matter, not in the ivory tower or on the sidelines, but on the front lines, saving lives, livelihoods, and our planet. If the T20 is to be effective in informing and shaping public policy, we must embrace, going forward, modernization and reform of our institutions so they can be as modern as the global marketplace of ideas and policy advice. This means in an information-rich world that we must be smarter, better, faster, and more agile and digital. the Global Policy Forum has not only provided a wonderful set of policy proposals and programs to help the G20 and the world respond to the daunting challenges we face, but equally important, it has provided a model for future T20 meetings that is inclusive, policy relevant, agile, and digital, that makes the T20 and the G20 policy briefs and all that is produced accessible to the policymakers, but above all else, accessible to citizens and civil society activists around the world. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you all who have contributed to this wonderful, enriching Global Policy Forum.